So I'm talking today to Marijana Grbesa and Berto Salaj, who are contributing an article for Contemporary Southeastern Europe on populism at the last Croatian presidential elections. So you looked at the discourse, the text, kind of looking at the text produced by candidates during the presidential elections. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more. So how populist were the candidates in your analysis?
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say that populism is really an under-researched phenomenon in Croatia, and this is why we got this important idea, we believe, to research populism. So it's well represented in the media discourse as a common point of reference. However, it's not well represented in academic discourse. That's how we basically started to research populism. As for presidential elections, what we try to do is we wanted to look at populism both as ideology, thin ideology, as we define it in the paper. And on the other hand, we also wanted to look at populism as a political communication style, because we differentiate between these two levels, and that's why we basically call our approach a two-level approach to investigating populism. In terms of the research material, we focused on the interviews of four presidential candidates, and we wanted to see how populist their discourse was. And what we found is that basically we had two true populist candidates, meaning that they fit well into what we define true populist in terms of ideology. And we defined one candidate at that time, the incumbent, who we labeled basically populist in style, who was introducing a lot of populist elements into his communication in order to appeal to people.
So there's a paradox in your conclusion in a certain way that the candidate who was an incumbent, who comes from a mainstream political party and also himself by background and so on is not a classical populist candidate, became a populist in style, as you identify in terms of his, and you describe it as maybe an attempt to in a certain way win the votes, kind of strategic effort. But then again, that seemed to have not worked in the end. So is populism not the universal recipe for success? So how do you see that relationship between populism and electoral success at the end of the day?
Yes, as you already said, we think that it was a try from Mr. Josipovic to get the vote from the different parts of the society, but in my opinion it was too late. It was too late to distance himself from the governing Social Democratic Party. And I agree with you that populist discourse and populist political communication style, as Croatian case is showing, is not a universal recipe for gaining political success.
I think the other point you make in your article, again, as you've also explained, that you have these two levels of analysis for populism. And if one of the critiques always of populism is that it's a label, a negative label associated and easily applied to others, but that it can become nearly meaningless because it can describe nearly everything, or anything which is not, let's say, very technocratic language could be labeled populism. So do you find on the basis of your analysis and the kind of two-level categories that populism can be rescued as a term, can be useful in the analysis, or do you have some doubts about the usefulness of populism as an analytical tool?
Well, for example, you can compare the concept of populism with the concept of pluralism. For example, as pluralism is some kind of meta-political ideology which consists of different kind of ideologies, conservatism, liberalism, social democracy, I think that we can understand populism as some kind also of meta-political ideology. Into the concept of populism, we can differentiate between different types of populism, left populism, right populism, but you're right, there is a huge amount of literature about what kind of phenomenon populism is. Is it only a strategy for political mobilization, or political communication style, or thin political ideology? We think that with our approach of these two right-centered political ideology, but as I said, is a kind of meta-political ideology which can consist of left populism like in Latin America and right-wing populism like in other parts of Europe.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the surprising findings exactly of your article is that when you do mention that the two extreme candidates to the left and to the right engaged in a populist campaign and were to some degree successful, but strikingly they weren't as successful as we see a tendency all over Europe now of anti-establishment candidates to be very successful. I believe that the two candidates from the far right and the far left gathered 16-17% of the vote in the first round, which is large but not earth-shatteringly large. Do you think that there is a particular reason to explain that there isn't this space for anti-establishment populism in Croatia at the moment? And the other kind of puzzling finding is that that the candidate of the HDZ, Grbesa, has not engaged in your analysis in particular populist strategies when you would expect it in a certain way, considering that it's an opposition candidate, a party which has a history of also using populist rhetoric. We've arguably seen it to some degree with the government in power in Croatia until recently. So what is it? Is it just personality which explains that variation, or is it that since the elections the Croatian and global or European context has changed so dramatically?
Okay, so there are 3 points that need to be addressed here. First of all, I'll begin with our current president, Grbesa Berto. First we analyzed only interviews. So we want to focus our interpretation on the interviews because we believe that basically by reading interviews we can they're proper material to analyze in order to investigate someone's discourse. We need to emphasize that it was the interviews that we were analyzing, and from the interviews, she did not basically resort to a great extent to any forms of populist style, let alone populism as an ideology. So it was probably due to the fact that one of the indicators that we used to identify populism is this anti-establishment. She did not resort to anti-establishment rhetoric, and that's very interesting. As opposed to the incumbent who resorted very gladly to anti-establishment rhetoric, trying to distance himself from the establishment and probably trying to gain the sympathy of the voters. So that's the first point. The second point about the right-wing populism, which is very interesting given our history and the strong nationalist slant that we have in our discourse. However, we did not find what we define as right-wing populism that needs to have also some kind of anti-establishment involved. We did not find that. We found something basically that we labeled nationalist populism, but not right-wing populism. And this is very interesting given our history. And finally, as for the rise of populist tendencies in Croatia, it would be very interesting, and we are looking at that right now, to look at the parliamentary elections. And as you know, we have, again, parliamentary elections because our government fell, so we are facing another elections in a few months. And populist discourse and populist options were very prominent in these elections as opposed to presidential elections. So it's going to be interesting. There is obviously a lot of room for populism in Croatia, and especially for this anti-establishment and we and the people rhetorics in Croatian public discourse.
Maybe just one short footnote about Grbesa Berto and about her rhetoric. We don't have in our paper the rhetoric
I think thank you so much, Marijana and Berto, for your insights. And I think you highlight all these, I think interesting topics which come out in your paper, and like highlight future research, which is on one side that populism can be a phenomenon of mainstream politics, not just of the fringes. That it can be used strategically and can be combined with conventional political messages. It's not one or the other. So that in a certain way we shouldn't believe the populists that that's them versus us or them versus the elites. That they themselves should be in a certain way look behind the facade of their rhetorical claims. So I think all of those are very useful pointers, and I think very very up to date, considering that we're talking about populism nearly every day, not just in Croatia but throughout Europe. So thank you so much for your article and your contribution for the journal.